So you've just heard about some of the motivations that compelled many of our early ancestors to migrate to New England, and some of the genealogical and pedagogical connections that strengthened their resolve. So next, you'll hear a little bit more about where they settled in New England and how the communities expanded in subsequent generations. Giving this presentation is David Dearborn. David joined the NEHGS staff in 1976 and has been interested in genealogy since the age of 18. He retired from NEHGS in early 2014, so we are very lucky to have him share his time and wisdom with us today. He is a fellow of the American Society of Genealogists, elected in 1982. He's written numerous articles in scholarly journals and assisted in many published books. Publications include Migrations Out of New England and Inside Tory, Perspectives of New England Marriages Prior to 1700. David has also been a frequent speaker at NEHGS and national genealogical conferences around the country. His primary genealogical interests include, of course, the Dearborn family, primarily descendants of Godfrey Dearborn, who arrived in New Hampshire by 1638, families of Essex County, Massachusetts, and of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. He's also interested in New York City and urban genealogy, 20th century genealogy, 18th and 19th century English and Scottish genealogy, Italian genealogy, and westward migration. So David will first give a brief history of the settlement of New England. He'll then examine the movement of people inland and the formation of second-generation towns. Finally, he'll provide you with a number of resources and research strategies to apply to your own research. You'll find a PDF of these slides at the conference webpage, as well as a detailed handout. And as with all of these presentations, you will be able to go back and rewatch the recordings of the presentation following the completion of the seminar. Again, just make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and David will answer as many as he can at the end of the presentation. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to David.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here today. And we're going to talk about migration to and within New England. This is a subject that is of interest to me, having a large chunk of New England ancestry. I'm one of those people whose ancestors, at least on my dad's side, never left New England. So I would say that I'm reasonably well acquainted with the settlement of New England and its geography and topography, which I think are important. The slide that you're looking at is obviously a rather humorous exaggeration of a New Englander's point of view, but it's I think there's something to be said about the fact that New England has a very big place in all of our hearts. So we're going to look at New England in a little more depth during this session. I think it's important to realize that it's not a cut and dried situation where people came here and they moved inland. When people came here and settled, the way that they settle in the various communities along the coast is pretty straightforward. It becomes more complex as people start moving into the interior, as we'll see a little bit later in the presentation. Generally, migration was not from east to west. You figure, well, people, basically were moving west. I mean, there was a certain amount of that to a degree, but it basically was from the coastal areas of New England into the interior, especially following the river valleys and the various other natural trails that existed into the interior parts of the area. I'm going to talk about each of the colonies in New England and how they differ from one another, partly because of how they were settled. Let's look at the early settlement of New England now, how the colonies were formed. This is a chart that I cribbed from one of Bob Anderson's Great Migration volumes. I don't know whether he showed this or discussed it, but it is a linear chart showing you the basic rate of migration to New England during the period from 1620 to 1640. my apologies if Bob discussed this earlier. You'll see, of course, starting with the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, down to around 1628. These numbers, of course, are approximations, but there were probably fewer than maybe 100 people a year arriving in New England from Old England up until that point. It was really quite small, and basically we're talking about Plymouth Colony, and then after about 1623, as we'll see a little bit later, we start to get settlement in other places along the New England coast, particularly Salem and Cape Ann, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that area there. Then you'll see there's this big spike in 1630, and that, of course, is the arrival of the Winthrop fleet. A number of ships arrived, led by Governor John Winthrop, and approximately 1,000 people arrived and settled in Boston. Then you can see after that it drops off again almost to the pre-Winthrop migration period. Then it starts picking up again a year later in 32, and then rapidly increases from about 1633 to 1639. Again, these numbers are approximate. The reason for this is because of the political and religious events that were taking place in England, with the elevation of Archbishop Laud, who had been the Bishop of London. He became the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was an implacable foe of the Puritans. He defrocked as many of the ministers in the churches in England who displayed Puritan tendencies, and those people, often led by their ministers, who felt that really the only way that they could get out of this is to flee and come to the New World. It picked up greatly. So as much as many of us would like to have an ancestor who arrived in the Mayflower or was here early, the basic fact is that the great majority of the people who settled in New England during the so-called Great Migration period, which is 1620 to 1640, almost all of them arrived in the tail end, that last approximately 7-year period. I know that's when most of mine arrived. And then it drops off rapidly by 1640. It didn't go right down to zero, but it dropped down considerably. And again, this is because of what was going on in England at that time. It was basically by the 1640s, the English Civil War was breaking out, and as we know, it ended with the defeat of the Royalists. Archbishop Laud was eventually executed, as was King Charles. Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector of England, and the Puritans came into their ascendancy. So that basically negated the need for people to, at least there wasn't the great pressure to emigrate for religious reasons. This is a book that any of you who are interested in the subject should be aware of. It's on the handout. It's called The Expansion of New England by Lois Kimball Matthews. It was originally published around 1904, 1906, somewhere in there, and it has been reprinted by NEHGS in paperback form. It's a wonderful book, and a number of the maps that I will be showing you, including the one that you see to the right, are basically lifted from this book. Ms. Matthews has this series of maps that basically show in the shaded areas those parts of New England that were settled by the English as of certain points. So here we see 1637, just before the outbreak of the Pequot War. It's near the end of the Great Migration period, but you can see that really it's only the coastal strip of land from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Portsmouth and Dover, down to Plymouth, around the Providence, Rhode Island area, and then a little string of settlements running up the Connecticut River from Saybrook up to Springfield, sort of an anomaly. That's really the only area of New England not on the coast that was settled, but of course the Connecticut River is a major pathway and avenue of migration. This is a map that I took from a book called The Atlas of American History by James Truslow Adams. I think it was published in 1943. I don't think that's on the handout, but it's a very useful book. And this map shows the whole United States. I simply reproduced the area covering New England to show you a little bit of the topography of New England. You can see how the major rivers all run in a north-south direction, and that the further north you go in New England, the more mountainous it becomes. Not only is it more remote, but because it is more mountainous, it means A, it's more difficult to get around, and B, the land is less promising for agriculture, which of course was the occupation that most of our ancestors would have served in. So it's important when you're looking at where people settled. There were reasons why they did so. Obviously, the people who arrived first chose the places that had good harborage, where they could anchor their ships without worrying about the ships being tossed around by the ocean. So obviously Boston Harbor, Salem Harbor, Providence, New Haven, and so forth. These were natural places for them to begin their settlements. And then from there they moved inland by way of the various rivers, which were the most natural course of moving around New England, as well as the Indian paths, which already were there, some of which developed into the so-called post roads. Most notably, the post road that ran along the coast from Boston down to New York City, and the one that went overland to Albany, New York. And later on, I'll talk a bit about so-called daughter towns or second-generation towns, those towns in the interior, how and why they were settled. As I said, first of all, the settlements began along the coast. When you were looking at New England as a whole, by and large, the vast majority of people settled in Massachusetts and Connecticut, with a lesser number in Rhode Island, mainly because, of course, it's that much smaller. And from the beginning of time down to the present, Massachusetts is definitely number one, Connecticut number two in terms of population. And when people started leaving New England and going further west, generally around the period from about the Revolution to 1850 is probably when the majority of your ancestors would have left. The majority of them either left directly from those states, or they might have gone by way of Vermont, but the ancestors eventually will be going back to those two states. There probably would be a smaller number of you whose ancestors originated in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. You can see pretty graphically from this map, which is more political than the one that I showed you before, which was strictly topographical, but you can still see how everything kind of runs in a north-south direction. And that's why people generally moved into the interior, but basically following the rivers from south to north. I mentioned Long Island, which you see at the bottom of that map, because even though politically today and for a very long time it's been part of New York, genealogically, almost all of Long Island, except for the very western tip, is genealogically connected to New England. Okay, we know now that there are 6 New England states, but there basically were 8 colonies originally in New England by the middle 1600s. Maine and Massachusetts until 1820 were one colony. Maine was originally called Ligonia, but that didn't last very long. It was basically the District of Maine in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Then we have New Hampshire, which for a very long time was not all of the area that we know today, but just a very little coastal strip, only about 13 miles long from Kittery, Maine down to Salisbury, Massachusetts. And then, of course, we have the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which did not include all of present-day Massachusetts, but basically from the northern boundary of present-day Massachusetts down to about Scituate, Massachusetts. Then anything south of that, there was sort of a diagonal line, which you can't see here, but we'll see a little later on, that basically runs from Scituate down to Wrentham, known as the Old Colony Line. That separated Massachusetts Bay Colony from Plymouth Colony, which is all of southeastern Massachusetts, including Cape Cod and the islands. Then Rhode Island was also 2 colonies as well. As we'll go into a little more depth, there was the colony of Rhode Island and the colony of Providence Plantations, which eventually merged. And then finally, Connecticut, the same thing. There were actually two colonies in Connecticut. There was the Connecticut colony, which was centered in Hartford, and there was the New Haven colony that was settled in New Haven, and those two merged as well. We'll look at these one by one, starting with Plymouth Colony, which, as we all know, was established in 1620 with the arrival of the Mayflower. Most of the people who arrived here were the so-called separatists who had originally fled to Holland, and then as they left, they stopped at Plymouth, picked up a number of so-called strangers, and they came over on the Mayflower and established the Plymouth Colony. Plymouth Colony, through all of its history, was really quite small. It might surprise you when you look at the Mayflower Silver Books and see how large some of the families were, but it was basically through natural increase and not through new in-migration. So the population was really quite small. By the 1690s, any religious differences there might have been between the Pilgrims and the Puritans were basically papered over, and Plymouth Colony basically allowed itself to be absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and from that point on it was all just simply the Massachusetts Bay Colony. People from Plymouth Colony tended to migrate or immigrate out of the Plymouth Colony area out into western Massachusetts, Berkshire County, over the line into Dutchess County, New York, which is the area just to the west of Connecticut, down to Cape May, New Jersey, and also by water up to the coastal area of Maine. These are all generalities. People from Plymouth Colony, or what was Plymouth Colony, went to other areas too, but these are generally places where people from that area of the world went. And I mention all of this because if you have ancestors who ended up in some of those places and you're trying to go back, it might be that some of those ancestors may go back into the former Plymouth Colony, that is southeastern Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Bay Colony really didn't get going until 1630 with the arrival of the Winthrop fleet, but actually it had been established some years earlier, as earlier as 1623, with settlements at Salem, Gloucester, other places in and around Cape Ann. And of course it was led by Puritans who differed slightly from the Pilgrims, who still considered themselves part of the Church of England and were not opposed to it, but believed that the forms of the religious services as practiced by the Church of England needed purifying, as it were. As I said, Massachusetts Bay from day one, once it got going, was the largest and most prominent of the New England colonies. But having come here for religious freedom, they didn't necessarily allow other people to stray from what they considered orthodox beliefs. And many of the other colonies that were established, as I show here, were brought on by ministers who were nominally Puritan, but who differed religiously with the authorities in Boston. Providence Colony was established by Roger Williams, who was a Puritan minister, but was basically a Baptist, did not believe in infant baptism, and brought his people down, his followers, that is, down to what is now Providence in 1638. Around the same time, and a little later, another group established a separate colony in the Newport area and received a charter for it in 1651, known as Rhode Island, because it's literally on what's known as Rhode Island. Roger Williams thought that he had a right, or that his charter for his area covered all of that. So eventually he and the Newport people made peace and the two colonies merged. But officially it's was the Providence and Rhode Island colonies. And even today, the state of Rhode Island's official name is the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Roger Williams, having been persecuted himself for his Baptist beliefs, was, unlike a number of the other ministers was tolerant of other sects, particularly Jews and Quakers who were shunned or persecuted in other parts of New England, particularly Massachusetts Bay, were welcomed into what is now Rhode Island. Rhode Island, as I said, is small in population and area. People tended to migrate from Rhode Island into eastern Connecticut, up into western Massachusetts, Vermont, and on into central New York. You don't see too many of them moving north into New Hampshire and Maine. Connecticut, as I said, there were 2 colonies there as well. The original settlement at Hartford was established by the Reverend Thomas Hooker, who was a Puritan minister from Cambridge, who disagreed mildly with the Puritan ministers in the Massachusetts Bay. So he said, I'm going to establish a town a little further west. They said, okay. And well, he just kept on walking down the so-called Connecticut path and ended up in Hartford, which of course was out of the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Bay. At about the same time or a little later, several second generation or daughter towns were established along the Connecticut River, Windsor being the most northerly in what's now Connecticut, the people having come from Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is now part of Boston, Wethersfield, which is just south of Hartford, settled by Boston. The people came around Cape Cod and then up the Connecticut River, and then most northerly, Springfield, Massachusetts, being settled from Roxbury, which is another community which is now part of Boston. Windham and Litchfield counties are respectively in the northeastern and northwestern corners of Connecticut, and because they're the most isolated, they were the last areas of Connecticut to be settled. Then further south, we have the so-called New Haven Colony, established by the Reverends John Davenport and Eaton, and they thought that the people in Boston were not strict enough religiously. At the same time, or thereabouts, a string of communities were settled along the southern Connecticut coast, as you can see here, Saybrook, Guilford, Milford, and Stratford. So basically running from the mouth of the Connecticut River down almost to the New York border along Long Island Sound. This group of communities were established. And I've listed where generally the original settlers came from, the various parts of England, or in the case of Stratford, Connecticut, you see there are people from places as distant from one another as Concord, Boston, Roxbury, and Wethersfield, Connecticut. Northern New England, as I said, never amounted to nearly as much as southern New England in terms of population, partly because it is remote, it's mountainous, and therefore the farming opportunities are poor. Also, because it was on the frontier, it was vulnerable to attack by the French and Indians until the conclusion of the French and Indian Wars in 1763, which basically did away with that threat. Even today, if you look at a map of northern New England, you'll see that there are very few roads that run in an east-west direction. That's because of the various mountains. Most everything, including the interstate highways, run in a north-south direction, usually following the rivers. There were people during the Great Migration who settled directly into what is now the coast of Maine and the coast of New Hampshire, and their descendants moved inland, but many of the people who later on settled northern New England basically were moving north from Massachusetts, just looking for opportunity, looking for free or cheap land, moving either directly into the interior or going up the Connecticut River Valley. Maine was, we'll talk about Vermont in just a moment, but Maine was such a large area, and even today, most of the northern part of Maine is unsettled, and therefore it acted as something of a safety valve, particularly for people from northeastern New England, eastern Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Instead of moving west, they would move east. And my own Dearborn ancestors did that. They moved to Maine around 1825 to a town that had been established about 10 years earlier up in the Penobscot Valley area. And there's not really much beyond it. It's pretty much even today more or less on the frontier up there. Let's look specifically now at the colonies up there. Dover and Portsmouth, New Hampshire are located on or very near the coast, but both have good harborage. They were among the very earliest settlements in New England. Most of the people came from the West Country, which I'm guessing Bob Anderson talked about. We're talking about southwestern England, Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, and Dorset. They tended not to be very religious. They mostly came over for economic reasons. Because they were on the water, they tended most of them not to be farmers, but instead were fishermen, mariners, merchants, and so forth. Contrary to that, you have the two settlements of Exeter and Hampton, which were quite different. They were established, both of them, in 1638 by renegade Puritan ministers who were basically driven out of Boston or fled because of their religious beliefs. The Reverend John Wheelwright, who was a brother-in-law of the famous or infamous Anne Hutchinson, and the Reverend Stephen Batchelder, who was an extremely controversial figure. If you read the sketch that Bob Anderson wrote about him and the Great Migration, it's really quite enlightening. I think Bob says that Batchelder is probably the most interesting character of all the hundreds or thousands of people that he wrote capsule biographies of, perhaps the most interesting, and then his sidekick, the Reverend Timothy Dalton. Old Norfolk County was one of the original 4 counties established by the Massachusetts Bay in 1643, the others being Suffolk, Middlesex, and Essex. And Old Norfolk County consisted of that part of Massachusetts north of the Merrimack River, but also extending into New Hampshire, which Massachusetts Bay claimed. Exeter and Hampton, having been settled by people from Massachusetts, even though they had fled, the towns of Exeter and Hampton, which are both, well, Hampton's on the coast but does not have a harbor. The people who settled there were basically farmers. They at least paid lip service to Massachusetts Bay rule and consider themselves as living in Norfolk County. Dover and Portsmouth were really quite different and really had nothing to do with it. And eventually in 1679, Norfolk County collapsed politically, that is, it was abolished, and those towns north of the present-day line between Massachusetts and New Hampshire formed the colony of New Hampshire, that is Dover, Portsmouth, Exeter, and Hampton. Norfolk County ceased to exist, and in 1793, the new county of Norfolk, which is south of Boston, was created, but they basically revived the old name. And if you will see some maps a little further on, you'll see that the area of settlement in New Hampshire for many, many, many decades was confined pretty much right to the coastal area. And this series of maps illustrates the very slow growth of the area of New Hampshire from the 17th century down into the 20th century. You can see right up until, through 1725, just a very narrow strip of land along the coast. Basically what is now Rockingham County, for the most part, was the area that was settled. By 1760 or so, you can see that it's expanded. It's going up that black area in the middle, going on the left-hand map. Yeah, it's going up the Merrimack River, and then way over on the bottom left, you can see a string of settlements going up the Connecticut River. By the next map, the French and Indian Wars are now over, and now we're up to the period just before the Revolution, I believe. You can see that now that it's safe, they don't have to worry about attack from the French and Indians. The whole interior part of the state is settled, except for that white area to the north, which is basically the White Mountains, and the area to the north of that, which is, well, even today, of course, is the White Mountains is a national forest, and no one really lives there. And then finally, the New Hampshire, as it is today, pretty much filled in. Governor Wentworth was governor. He was the royal governor of New Hampshire prior to the Revolution in the 1740s, 50s, 60s, and was a bit of a wheeler dealer. And he was very well connected politically, both in England and in America. And he granted townships to many of his cronies and friends and people who would pay him off or whatever. And so a lot of the settlement of New Hampshire, it really just exploded from the mid 1700s into the late 1700s was thanks to grants of land of townships that were passed out by Governor Wentworth. Maine is the last of the old colonies that we'll talk about here. It never was very, very large, and because it was the most exposed of all of the colonies, it was probably the most susceptible to attack by the French and the Indians. During King Philip's War in 1675, it was abandoned completely. Everybody left, those who weren't killed or carried away. Those people who left went down to mostly to Essex County, Massachusetts, and Boston, and then they slowly went back afterwards. But of course, they were always fearful of attack right into the early 1700s. Back in the 1970s, I wrote an article on the descendants of Philip Durrell or Durrell, and his family was attacked not once but twice. So it was a very real danger. After the Revolution, most of the people who settled in Maine either were descendants of the original settlers moving further north or into the interior, or moving over from New Hampshire. But after the Revolution, a lot of people from eastern Massachusetts, and particularly Cape Cod, started moving overland and settling along the Maine coast and moving inland. The next series of maps, again, is from the Matthews book and shows the areas of settlement we saw in 1637. Contrast that with just 40 years later, 1675, just before the outbreak of King Philip's War. You can see how much has filled in, but you can see that the whole central area of Massachusetts and eastern Connecticut is still white. It's still empty. But the settlement goes out into Middlesex County, and then a strip of settlement almost continuous right up the Connecticut River, up as far as Deerfield and Northfield, and then a strip of settlement along the coast about as far east as Damerscott, Maine. Now, and also Long Island, if you'll notice that down there. Now just see what that area looks like. And now we'll go to the next slide and see what happens if you look at the map on the left. This is 2 years later after King Philip's War. There were not that many New Englanders who were killed. There certainly were some, and a lot of people who lived out on the frontiers had their houses burned. Basically what the New Englanders did was they pulled in their horns. They moved back to much more defensible lines, much less area that they had to defend against the Indians. And it stayed this way for about another 30 years. Things did not, the population continued to grow, but the area of settlement grew only very slowly. You can see on the right-hand map, by 1713, which was the time of the Treaty of Utrecht, that the area of settlement really wasn't a whole lot bigger than it had been back in 1675. And that was just because of the fear of attack from the French and the Indians. And northern New England is basically completely unsettled. Now let's look at the so-called second generation or daughter towns. There are two types of second generation towns. There are those that are contiguous, that is, towns that were broken off from other towns. So we get a towns like, say, Dorchester, Massachusetts, which split off or shed off daughter towns such as Milton, Braintree, Canton, Stoughton, Sharon, Foxborough, Walpole. All are daughter towns of what had originally been Dorchester. Salem, Massachusetts did the same thing. The daughter towns of Beverly, Peabody, Danvers, Middleton, all had been a part of Salem originally. Usually these early towns were very, very large in area, and as people moved out to the extremities of these areas, they wanted to have first their own parish, and then later on their own government, so they would become so-called daughter towns. But when I'm talking about second generation towns, the other kind are those that are non-contiguous. That is, they're totally separated from other towns. And these are towns that were settled by people who came from those towns that had originally been settled. And I have a list of some of these here. This is certainly not all of the second generation towns that existed. These are just some of the more prominent ones and where they came from. The first of them being Concord in 1635. But as we saw going up the Connecticut River, towns like Springfield, Massachusetts, Deerfield were also non-contiguous with other towns and were also basically considered daughter towns as well. This is a map from a book called The Historical Atlas of Massachusetts, and it shows the political map of Massachusetts never looked like this, but this shows you all of the original towns, how they were laid out, and what their relative areas were, and then the color shading indicates the time that these towns were incorporated as communities. So we can see, for example, if you can find it on there, Dorchester, Mass., which doesn't even exist anymore as a town. It was swallowed up, absorbed by the city of Boston in 1870, but you can see what a large area it took up. Down to the just below that, you'll see that diagonal line that runs along there. That's the so-called Old Colony line, which still exists. It's now the boundary between Norfolk County and to the north and Plymouth and Bristol counties to the south, but that was the original dividing line between Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony. And as I say, that line is still there. I cross it myself probably a couple of times a week. And you can see if you go up to Salem how much larger Salem was an area than it is today, before the daughter towns were sloughed off. Same thing if you go out and look in western Massachusetts at Springfield, an enormous area. Places like West Springfield and Chicopee and Agawam and Wilbraham and Ludlow all were daughter towns to Springfield. And you could go on and on with examples of this. So it's to me, it's important to understand how the towns developed because your ancestor may have been affected by the boundaries. Down in the lower left of Bristol County is the town of Rehoboth. And when I first got started in genealogy, I have an ancestor who settled there in the early 1600s. And then he lived in Attleboro, and then he lived in North Attleboro, and I thought he was physically moving, and it was only later on that I realized he never moved a foot. What happened was just parts of Rehoboth were being sloughed off into new towns, and he had been in Rehoboth, and then one day he woke up and it was now the town of Attleboro, at least the northern part of Rehoboth had been set off as a separate town. And then later on, North Attleboro was split off from Attleboro. His house is still standing, by the way. So this is where it's important and very useful to just know not only the geography and topography, but also the political history of how the towns developed. It might answer some of your questions. Let's look back at some of the states and how the daughter towns developed. In the case of Rhode Island, they were anxious to make sure that Connecticut did not continue to encroach eastward into what they considered their territory. So they established towns further west, particularly westerly Charleston, Hopkinton, Richmond, to establish their western border and lay claim to whatever land that they could. Connecticut was doing the same thing. They were pushing outward from the coastal area and the Connecticut Valley and establishing the various towns that I've listed here. Bob, I'm sure, did not mention it, but if we look, this is just to show you how complex settlement in New England can be. If we look at Lebanon, back in the 1970s, Bob wrote a little history of the town of Lebanon, Connecticut, which is a second-generation town. And you can see that Lebanon is somewhat east of Hartford. It's kind of between Hartford and Providence. And the people came from three different disparate areas: New London, Connecticut, which is on the coast, Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Northampton, Massachusetts. People from these three separate areas came and established Lebanon. And of course, eventually these various families intermarried with one another. And so if you have ancestors living in Lebanon, maybe in the early to mid 1700s, you could have ancestors going back to any one or perhaps all of these various parent towns to Lebanon. Long Island, you could consider most of the towns down there to be second generation towns as well. As I said, it was basically genealogically an extension of New England. There was a lot of going back and forth. A number of the people who went down to Long Island were of the Quaker persuasion, who were fleeing from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or there are people who are just going down there to settle because the land on the island is basically good. The very western end of the island, most of the people are Dutch, and of course it was basically a Dutch colony until New Netherlands was taken over in the 1660s. And from Long Island, of course, a lot of people fled Long Island during the American Revolution because it was held by the British and moved to Connecticut. A lot of people also moved into what's now Westchester County, New York, or off into New Jersey and elsewhere. The Treaty of Utrecht brought a long period of peace to New England, and it didn't end raids by the French and Indians completely, but it made it a lot easier, as we saw from those maps a few minutes ago. The Treaty of Utrecht basically ended what we in America call Queen Anne's War, which lasted from 1702 to 1713. In England, it was known as the War of the Spanish Succession. Probably brings back bad memories of junior high school history. But it was a period of great unrest in New England until that area was settled. And as we have already seen, there was it just opened up a whole period of movement into the interior of New England. Let's start looking now at some of the other non-English groups that came in. Probably the most notable being the Ulster Scots, or Scotch-Irish as they're often erroneously called. They began arriving in 1718. These are people of Scottish descent whose ancestors had either been enticed or forced by Cromwell in the 1640s to leave Scotland, generally the southern and western parts of Scotland, Renfrewshire, Ayr, Argyll, and areas like that, and move over to Northern Ireland, to the part known as Ulster. After a couple of generations, a lot of these Ulster Scots became disenchanted with life in Ireland, and so they petitioned for permission to come to New England. And being they weren't English, but at least they were Protestant, so they were welcomed. They were, of course, Presbyterian, which is not that much different from the beliefs of the Puritans, what became the Congregational Church. Generally, they did not move into communities already settled by the people who already were here. They established their own communities, generally out on the frontier. And I've listed a number of the more prominent Ulster Scots settlements in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. There are settlements elsewhere. There are some in Connecticut too, but these are some of the main settlements where the Ulster Scots originally settled. Berkshire County is an area that was a great jumping off point for people to go either into Vermont later on or over into New York. A lot of people were transitory going through that area. It's not an area I'm terribly familiar with genealogically, but it's an interesting area because so many people have ancestors who traversed Berkshire County at one time or another. Because it's on the border of Massachusetts and New York, it attracted settlers from both Massachusetts and New York. Some of the Dutch settlers from the Hudson River Valley moved over, particularly into the southern and western parts of Berkshire County. Um, Also, a lot of people from Connecticut attended from Litchfield, Fairfield and Litchfield counties, and also the northern part of Hartford County, up around Simsbury and that area, Enfield and that, moved over into parts of Berkshire County. And again, you can see how complex the settlement patterns are, where you get these towns, say, such as Sandusfield, um, down in the southwestern part of the county, being settled by people from Enfield, Connecticut, Wethersfield, Connecticut, which is further south, and also from Cape Cod. Let's go on from there. And then here are further towns, and again, the complex settlements where people were coming from, different areas. Williamstown, for example. Many of the original settlers were from Connecticut, Northampton, and Hatfield. Two things I would suggest for finding where your people might have hailed from. First is, of course, a lot of them, if there is a town history of the town that you're interested in, if it talks about the original settlement, that is, if your ancestors were part of the original settlement and didn't arrive later, oftentimes the town histories will either say or give you an idea of where the original settlers came from. The second thing that you might want to try is Clarence Torrey's New England Marriages prior to 1700. Even though it cuts off in 1700, oftentimes it will tell you what happened to the people after that. They might have lived for decades after their marriage and may have moved to another town, and Torrey will indicate that. And by looking for your common name, seeing if there are any people of that name who settled in the towns that you're interested in, you might be able to look at the sources that Torrey lists for that couple, see whether it lists the children of that couple who themselves would not qualify for Torrey, but are listed in Torrey because the parents are listed, that might allow you to work back and find out what the parent town was where your people came from. You might run into these if you have ancestors living on the northern border of Massachusetts. You might find references to the Canada grant towns and wonder what those are. I've listed these here. If you see them, these towns are not in Canada. They were just called Canada because they were these so-called Canada grant towns. And to the right, I've listed the present names of these towns. There's also the Narragansett townships, which I've listed here, which were granted to in 1728 to the heirs of King Philip's War. And then finally, the so-called Monadnock townships, which were in southwestern New Hampshire. This was a string of towns that were granted basically to act as kind of canaries in the coal mine. If the French and Indians came down to attack, presumably they'd be going through these towns and the alarm would be sounded, and those towns further to the south would be made aware that there was trouble on the way. Now, Massachusetts did not give up on claiming New Hampshire, and as you can see from this list here, which again is not complete but is basically meant to be illustrative, the colony of Massachusetts Bay continued granting townships in areas that were not under its jurisdiction, hoping, I guess, that the folks up in New Hampshire wouldn't notice. And in addition to that, there were towns that were settled by people from Massachusetts. They were clearly in New Hampshire, but people were simply moving across the line looking for free or cheap land. And you can see, as I said earlier, a lot of the people who settled in New Hampshire later on were not descendants of the original New Hampshire settlers, but people moving up from Massachusetts, or in the very western part of New Hampshire, moving up from Connecticut. Maine continued to be small for a very long time. Really not until probably the Revolution did Maine really get going in terms of population. As I say there were really no settlements north of Berwick or east of Georgetown prior to 1720. So three-quarters of the northern part of the state really is settled, if it was at all, after the Revolution. I mentioned the Ulster Scots, the Waldoboro Germans deserve a mention. These are people who came from what is now the Czech Republic in the mid-1700s. around the time of the Revolution, about half of them moved down to North Carolina, settled in I think it's Guilford and Onslow counties, North Carolina, to join other Moravians, but others stayed in Maine, and their descendants are still there today. Vermont was never a colony prior to the Revolution. It was basically a no man's land. Either it was ignored or considered too dangerous an area, and it wasn't until the 1720s that settlement began in the extreme southeast corner of the state, down near where Brattleboro is today at Fort Dummer. And really until the 1750s, 60s, the settlement of Vermont was confined to the extreme southeastern corner of the state. And again, it was only after the French and Indian War that settlement really exploded in Vermont. But because of the mountainous spine of the Green Mountains, settlement tended to be along the very eastern border of Vermont, the Connecticut River, and also the western part of the state going up to Lake George and Lake Champlain. And here I've listed some of the areas, some of the towns in Vermont and where people came from. And again, you can see the rather complex patterns where people are coming from and where they're going to. And you can see now, here we are just before the French and Indian War. We can see that pretty much all of the three southern New England states are almost completely full, except for Berkshire County, but that northern New England is still lagging behind. And if you, this map doesn't really show it, but assuming that that shaded area, the population of that whole area is consistent, you can see how southern New England had a much greater population even in those days than did northern New England. And that trend continued right on down into the 20th century. By the 19th century, things started reversing. People, of course, were moving west out of New England. At the same time, northern New England was becoming something of a rural backwater. The Industrial Revolution was well underway. So people were leaving the farms and coming to the cities of southern New England. And at the same time, new immigrant groups were starting to come in. Now let's look at a few sources and search strategies for ways that you can maybe find out about your ancestors. I mentioned town histories already. If they have a genealogical section, that's wonderful, but you have to take them with a grain of salt. This happens to be a page from, I believe it's the history of Plymouth, New Hampshire, which was originally settled by people mostly from Stratford and Rockingham counties, New Hampshire, for the most part, and some from Massachusetts too. One of the things, of course, that we have in New England that you don't find elsewhere are vital records, and particularly if you have, once you get into the mid to late 19th century where you have vital records which include parents' names and places of birth, it might give you a clue as to where people came from. Of course, this is assuming that your ancestors stayed put in New England. If they had the bad sense to move off into New York or Ohio or elsewhere, then of course you're not going to find these records. But for those who stayed put, the vital records improved drastically after 1850, and you can find potentially a lot of information for tracking people backwards. Probably even more important are probate and land records. A lot of people in New England, particularly people who are relatively new to genealogy, often ignore these, figuring, well, we have all of these vital records. I really don't need to worry about all of those messy probate and land records, but you do so at your peril. There's a gold mine of information that's included in these, and NEHGS has many of these here on microfilm. A lot of them are or have been digitized either on AmericanAncestors.org, FamilySearch.org, or Ancestry.com. Here we have just an example. This is a page from land records for Essex County, Massachusetts. If we look down the bottom, 1745, it's a deed in which a man named James Wooden of Brunswick in the county of York, house right. This is Maine. This is Brunswick, Maine, which had been in York County, is now, I think, in Sagadahoc County. And Abigail, his wife, one of the daughters of Thomas Gould, late of Salem in the county of Essex, this is in Massachusetts, is selling a piece of property in Salem. I'm showing you this because it shows this very nice, well, not only does it identify all these people, but it shows you these people who presumably formerly lived in Salem, Massachusetts, but have moved to Brunswick, which of course in those days it was considered part of Massachusetts, but of course is actually in what is today the state of Maine. So it's a very good example of showing you, where people would have come from. Once you get to the period of the American Revolution, if you're lucky, you might find an ancestor who not only served, but who might have maybe had a military pension. Here we have a pension record for the widow Anna Dearborn, who's living in the town of Chelsea in Orange County, Vermont in 1838, petitioning that she's the widow of a man named Asa Dearborn from New Hampshire who served in the Revolution. So again, if we were trying to trace this family back, we can get them from Vermont back into New Hampshire thanks to this particular record. If your ancestor had a gravestone, you might also, of course this is somewhat unusual, but I'm showing it just to show that they are out there. Here you have the example of the person following the safety valve of going from New Hampshire to Maine. Instead of going west, he went east. He was born in the town of Deerfield, New Hampshire, but died in the town of Corinna, Maine, which is up in the Bangor area. He went up there in the 1820s, and the gravestone illustrates that move very nicely. And manuscripts. NEHGS is a library like no other, and you never know what you're going to find. This is a page from a Dearborn genealogy that happens to be here, that's to be found nowhere else. And we have a large number of these. And we're not the only place that has manuscripts, of course. You'll find them at other historical and genealogical libraries around the area, but certainly we're a good place to start. Our catalog is online, and you should certainly see if there's anything that has not been published that might possibly help you to break through your migratory brick wall.
All right. Thank you, David. So let's stop here and see if you have any questions for David. Feel free to type your question into the chat panel on the right of your screen. So we have a few questions about kind of specific movements, areas, micro-migrations. I don't think we'll be able to ask all of them, and some of them are very specific. So again, if you have some specific questions about, why did families end up here or go from here to here, feel free to send those to me and I can pass those on to David. But some more general questions regarding kind of the islands, especially off of Cape Cod. Linda asks, can you kind of comment on the settlement of Martha's Vineyard and migration of family groups to it or from it? And Sue is also asking about Nantucket and Nantucket's relation to Rhode Island. So if you could just maybe say a few words about Martha's Vineyard and then Nantucket, that would be great.
Yes. Martha's Vineyard was settled, I think, around the 1660s or so, and Nantucket about the same time. They were fairly late in terms of the 17th century. I don't remember exactly why, but again, as physicists like to say, nature abhors a vacuum, and here were these islands sitting out there, and so it wasn't going to go unclaimed, and people went out there. Nantucket, I know, was settled pretty early. Tristram Coffin, who was from Newbury, Massachusetts, went down there. Folgers, some of the other families from the area. I really can't say specifically more because I don't know, but basically it was just people looking for land.
All right. And certainly they were Quakers too. I know that was a big part of Nantucket, or Nantucket settlement. So Sandra is asking more kind of about travel, and she asks, so how would someone have traveled from, say, Portsmouth, New Hampshire to New London, Connecticut in around 1690? Would they have gone by sea? Would they have traveled overland? How long would it have taken? So are these and I think this is maybe an important point. I mean, thinking about the length of travel and how does that kind of come into your understanding of your ancestors' movements, and does it make sense too?
Hard to say specifically. It could have been either by water or land, and since both places are on the water, yeah, there were people who either made their living by transporting goods and people from point A to point B, or they could have hitched a ride with someone they knew. And of course, it might have been not one straight trip. They might have taken a boat as far as Boston and then another boat further around. By then, there were roads. The post road was up and going then, and so they would have gone either on their own by horseback, I suppose, or on foot, or I don't know whether there are, what we would, call stagecoaches later on, but very early on, there were some people who made their living by establishing inns or ordinaries. And if you figure that a person could walk maybe 10 miles a day, maybe at the most, probably, they would just walk along the road, which is basically just a pathway in those days, and just spend the night at an inn where they would have lodging and food and relative safety. And they would just, if you were going from, say, what's now Portsmouth, New Hampshire down to Connecticut, it probably would have taken probably at least several days, if not a week or so, I suppose, in those days, if you were to do it overland.
All right, and just one more question. So Annie asks, she says that she's curious about the area along the Connecticut River at the border of Connecticut and Massachusetts, specifically between Windsor and Deerfield. She says it shifted around a lot. Several of my lines were there for generations. Then there was kind of this rapid out-migration. Do you have any thoughts about kind of the dynamics of that settlement and migration specific to that area?
Well, the Connecticut River Valley was settled very, very early. We saw that Hartford, of course, was settled in 1636. Windsor, I think it was 1638. Springfield, I think 1639. So there were people there very, very early. And of course, they spread out on both sides of the river. I'd say probably 10 miles inland into, say, what's now Westfield, Mass, over to like the Stores, Connecticut area, up into, Ludlow, and that whole area going up the valley. Because if you're familiar with it, it's compared to the areas further east and further west, it was pretty decent land. The main, of course, migratory corridor would have been up and down the Connecticut River. Later on, a lot of people from that general area tended to move into Berkshire County, or they moved up into Vermont, or straight into eastern New York somewhere. I don't know whether that answers the question or not. The actual physical line between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Connecticut Colony was drawn fairly early. At some point they did a survey and determined where the line was, which basically separated Enfield, Connecticut from Springfield, Massachusetts. So that, was well known from fairly early times on. Springfield was Massachusetts, Enfield was part of Connecticut.
All right. And again, there were some questions that we didn't get to. Feel free to send those to me and I'll pass them on to the appropriate instructor. But right now it's time for another break. During the break, here's an activity, a possible activity for any Mayflower descendants out there in the audience. So last November, we began an interactive website to highlight our activities and scholarship pertaining to Mayflower genealogy and history. So if you go to mayflower.americanancestors.org, we have a map where descendants can post a picture of themselves with a location kind of sharing whom they're descended from and kind of what it means to be a Mayflower descendant. We currently have just around 1,900 submissions to that map. The 2020th submission, of course, playing on the 2020, the year 2020, the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. So the 2020th submission to our map will receive a special gift and potentially some bragging rights on social media. So something to consider during the next break.